So sermons are not just to be preached for the sake of preaching sermons. There is a reason that you're preaching that sermon. At least there ought to be a reason. Now, you and I have probably both sat through sermons where at the end of the sermon we scratched our heads and we said, what was the point of that sermon? What was I supposed to get because I sure didn't get it? We don't want people to come out of a message that we're preaching asking that question. We need to ask ourselves first, what is it? What message is it that God has placed upon my heart that needs to get into the hearts of the hearers? And we need to focus our presentation on getting those messages across. And Paul gives us some great counsel to get us started. He says in 2 Timothy 4, verses 2 to 4, now we're on the spark one. We're going to leave the other one until maybe the very end if we have any time left. He says, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and teaching. For the time will come when people will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers, and they will turn their ears away from what? Truth, and be turned aside to what? Fables. Whenever we depart from the pure, unadulterated Word of God, as we are preaching and teaching, we end up sending people to follow fables. There are enough preachers of fables out there. We don't need to add to that number. We want to point people back to the Word of God each and every single time. So what are some guidelines that we can use to make sure that when we are called to preach, we preach powerfully in a way that's going to change people's lives, where God can use us to reach those people. Preach with conviction. Preach like you mean what you're saying, because I hope that you do. If you don't believe what you're preaching, how on earth do you expect them to believe it? So you've got to believe it with all of your heart. God has given you the most powerful, life-changing message ever in the history of the world to share. One of my friends once said, it is a sin for an Adventist preacher to be boring. I think there's some truth in that. I mean, we live in the last days of Earth's history with the most incredible message ever given to mankind. How on earth can we make that boring? I mean, it is an incredible message, the likes of which no one else has, and we can use that and share it with others. Make Christ the center. Regardless of the topic, Christ should be the center of your sermon. I'll speak specifically here to evangelistic sermons, but it applies also to the sermons that you might have on any given Sabbath. Find Jesus in the middle of the sermon. How would we find Jesus in, for example, the message of Daniel chapter 2? If you were going to preach an evangelistic sermon on Daniel chapter 2, where would Christ be in Daniel 2? How could you weave him into Daniel 2? I mean, it's all well and good that we go through Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar and the dream and so forth, but what's the focus of the message of Daniel 2, and where is Christ in that?
I think you would have to think about what Daniel is going through emotionally and how he has to depend on God and
Good. So he's in hot water because all of the wise men are about to be executed. Who does he go to for help? He goes to Jesus for help. Yes.
In a couple of different situations. First of all, he's kind of like Jesus in that he's saving those wise men's lives, and eventually they're going to try to take his life.
Exactly.
But the culmination of the whole story is this stone cut out without hands.
That's it. So we can focus. That's where the focus needs to be. We bring everything else in, but that's all as supporting evidence for that stone and the centrality of Jesus in the message. How about the message of the 2,300 days? Where is Jesus in the message of the 2,300 days? 1 week. 1 week, that's it. The 1 week, the 7 years, yeah, of the 2,300 days. And what other message? We often, if we're not careful, we can spend a lot of time diagramming and charting and dating all those 2,300 days. What is the big message of the 2,300 days? What's it about?
He is the high priest.
It's about judgment, right? He is the high priest. He is the one who wants to save us and makes that possible. So don't get so bogged down in the 1844 and 538 and 1798 and all these. We get in dates all the time, and they're good. They help to support us and move us in the right direction. But don't get bogged down in dates. Whether you're talking about the Antichrist, or the role of the United States in prophecy, or the health message, or judgment, or Daniel 2, make Christ the center of each and every sermon. that kind of brings us to point number 3. Determine the main point. Jesus is the focal point, but what facet of truth is it that you're trying to emphasize? Daniel 2, we know who Jesus is, that he is that rock. He sets up, or his eternal kingdom is the rock. He's the king of that kingdom. But what other truth are we trying to emphasize? Well, Daniel 2, God knows the future and he reveals it. What's a big truth that we're trying to focus on in health? God has described acceptable and unacceptable ways to treat our bodies. Why does he care how we treat our bodies? Why does he care how we treat our bodies? We're the temple of God, right? How much did he pay for us? Everything. He paid a price that we cannot even begin to conceive for us. And so he wants us to take care of these bodies as well. As far as constructing the sermon, you want to begin with an interesting introduction, or often that takes the form of an illustration. Where can you find illustration? We're on points 4 and 5, kind of blending those together. The word illustrate means to shed light on. That's what the word illustrate. You've heard of something that's lustrous. It's bright. So illustrate means to shed light on. We're trying to take a concept in a message that we're sharing and make it more easily understandable. Taking lofty concepts and bringing them down to the level of the listeners. This is something that a preacher has it's a unique challenge to preaching. Because if you go to a doctor's office and the doctor examines you, and then you sit down and he or she is about to explain to you what the problem is, what it is that's making you sick. Have you ever listened to a doctor and the doctor explains what the problem is and you are more lost after the explanation than before? Because he uses these big words and talks about processes and systems in the body that you don't have any idea what they have. You've been there before. Okay? How does that make you feel when you come out of that little debrief with the doctor like that? Maybe like you don't know what's going on. Yeah, kind of empty, maybe a little frustrated, confused. Or let's talk about it another way. Thank you, sweetie. Have you ever been to the mechanic before? Yeah. Have you been to the mechanic before? And your car was making a clunking or a squealing noise. You took it in, and after a big examination, then the mechanic says, well, the problem is the radial distributor cap on the muffler or something. And you don't know what he just told you. But one thing you do know, what's it going to cost you? It's going to cost you an arm and a leg. You don't really know what's going on. You don't understand it, but supposedly he does. For preachers, it's different. We cannot afford to speak a language that the people don't understand. What we have been given is a message that can be difficult to understand. These are lofty ideas. So Christ took these huge ideas and he simplified them down into a form that people could understand. It made it easy for a child to understand. Somebody once put it this way. For a preacher, what we do, our job is to take the theological concepts, $1,000 bills, if you will. We take these $1,000 bills to the money changers and we break them down into the coin of the realm. See, theologians have these lofty ideas. Theologians deal in $1,000 bills. Not us. We want to be able to understand things simply. People have to understand them simply. So we take these $1,000 bills, break them down into 10s and 20s so that people can go, I get that. Because if people walk out of a sermon that we preached and they go, I have no idea what he or she just said. It just went clean over my head. What good have we done? Very little. Very, very little. So we want to use illustrations to do that. When you're also preaching, you want to be aware of verbal and physical crutches, ums, ers, likes. How many times have you heard somebody say like in a message? It can get very distracting. In fact, what happens if you have one of these verbal crutches, well, let me back up. One of the best ways to find out if you have one of these things going on is to videotape yourself preaching. And that is one of the most painful experiences you will ever have. Because you thought everything was fine until you sit there and watch and listen to yourself speak. And all of a sudden you begin to see your warts all over the place. And it's bad. I remember one of the very first sermons, it wasn't even a sermon, it was about a 10 or 15 minute message that I preached. I was at Sacramento Central Church, which most of you know is not a small church. It's a very large church. There were probably 600, 800 people there or something like that. I mean, relatively small congregation. And I was asked to give about a 10 or 15 minute message. And I did, and I came off afterwards, and I felt pretty good about it. Pastor Doug shook my hand and congratulated me afterwards. And I did all right, praise the Lord. Afterwards, I got a copy of the video cassette, and I started watching it. And I don't know what the issue was, but I think before I started preaching, I forgot to tighten the bolts on my neck, because for the whole message, I was doing this. And it was a bobblehead all over. I had no idea that I was doing that. But when I sat and watched it, all of a sudden it's like, okay, not going to do that again. That needs to be fixed. And if you have these verbal crutches, the likes, the ums, the ers, the you knows, these things, they need to come out of the message because they can be distracting. What happens otherwise is if you say like all the time, you're going to start to have people in the congregation who will be doing this. They'll keep track of your likes. And they'll lean over to the person. If that was a 46 like sermon, what did you get? I got 48. Oh, I missed a couple, right? So it will distract people from the message that you have. You want them to focus on the message, not the distractions that could be there. Another thing, if you're going to preach, get rid of anything that is in your pockets. Because if you've got stuff in your pockets, you will be sitting there fiddling with them, messing around. If you need to wear glasses, great. And I know you hit about age 40, 45, the whole reading glasses thing comes in, but you need to be careful that it doesn't become something that is distracting, on and off, on and off, on and off. If you've got a belt or something, don't always be hiking up your pants. Just relax up there. And I know that can be very difficult to do, but relax. Take a deep breath. Remember, it's not about you, it is about Christ. One other thing that's important to remember as you're preaching is to be relaxed. Now, it's very easy for me to tell you, be relaxed up front, because the first few times that you preach, your main focus is staying alive. That's your main focus. If I can just live through the message, I'll be okay. And so the first few times that you preach, you probably got your notes and your manuscript up here, and you are white knuckling the edge of the pulpit. And you're just standing behind it and shaking like a leaf. And you know why we stand behind the pulpit up front? The reason is very simple. Because the pulpit protects us from the people. And the people are out to get us. And if we can just stay behind the pulpit, it will protect us from the people. The people are with you. The people want to hear what you're going to share. They've come because they believe you have a message from the Lord. So let that message come through. And as you become a little bit more comfortable, you can start to kind of come out a little bit from behind the pulpit. You might even take one of your hands off the pulpit and do a gesture or something like that. You can come over to the other side and try it with your left hand. And, the more frequently you preach, the more you start to become more comfortable, and you come out from the side over here and look kind of relaxed. You're not rigid, just kind of drop your shoulders a little bit and keep your chin a little bit up, not high, but and just kind of a fairly relaxed. I mean, you don't want to be like this, but a little bit relaxed. You can come over to the other side as well. Talk to the people over here. You want to let your gaze move around the entire congregation. Don't let anybody feel left out. And as you become more and more confident, you might actually get to the point where one day you could almost separate yourself from the pulpit. You could do that for just a moment. It takes a little while to get there, but you'll get there in time. Don't distract people. You can go the other direction. You can spend so much time talking and moving from one side to the other. Let's slide all over the floor here. You can spend so much time doing this that people get distracted by your movement. So don't just stand there like a stick. And don't spend so much time moving that you are distracting people. But find that balance that works for you. I like to come out from behind the pulpit from time to time because it helps to connect with the people there. You know who we like to look at in the audience? Sometimes people say, if you're afraid of people, then just look over their heads. Don't make eye contact, but look over their heads. don't do that. You want to connect with people. You want them to feel like they're connecting with you. Make eye contact with people. Now, when I say make eye contact with people, that doesn't mean that you should just stare at one person through the entire message and look at them, because if all you're doing is looking at that one person through the whole message, how does it make that one person feel? A little uncomfortable, right? So, yeah, they start shaking, right? So just let your gaze travel around. You don't have to look at each person in the eye. You only have to one by one look at each person. If you kind of look generally in this direction, everybody over there thinks, he's looking at me. You're not even really looking at every person, but they feel like you are, and that's really important. So engage your audience. Be approachable. What time do I have? I got 5 minutes.
I got an alarm though.
You got an alarm? Okay. Let me see if I can squeeze this in real quick. Things are going to go wrong. Things are going to go wrong in your sermons. If you're preaching evangelistically and you've got slides, anticipate that you're going to have technical problems. You just will at some point or another. Always have a hard copy of your sermon notes. Because if everything else goes wrong, if you lose electricity, if your projector bulb blows up, if your sound system goes down, you've got a hard copy of your sermon notes. You can still continue preaching. I mean, I've had anything and everything go wrong. I was preaching one time down in, I think it was Louisiana. And as I was preaching, my wife has heard my messages many, many times. They change bit by bit here and there, but generally speaking, they're pretty much the same. She knows kind of when I pause and when I pick up the pace and so forth to make a point. Well, she was out in the foyer dealing with the handouts for after the meeting, and I paused at a point where she was not accustomed to me pausing in the message. And it was a long